6 strips of bacon lay on a white ceramic plate, thick cut, edges dark and crispy, fat glistening in the early morning light of a Texas prison camp dining hall. 91 pounds. That's what she weighed when she stepped off the transport ship in Oakland, California on September the 15th, 1944. 91 pounds stretched over a 5'2" frame that had once carried 120. 3 years of war had carved away everything soft, everything unnecessary for survival. Her name was Reiko Nakamura. She was 23 years old. She was an Imperial Japanese Army nurse. And she hadn't eaten meat in 3 years. Back in Hiroshima, her mother was boiling tree bark to make soup. But before we go any further, if this story matters to you, hit that like button below. Stories like this need to be told, they need to be remembered, and they need to be shared. Now, let's begin. The morning fog rolled thick across San Francisco Bay on September 15, 1944. The kind of fog that makes sound travel strange, that turns ships into ghosts before they solidify into steel and rust. Sergeant Wyatt Morrison stood on the Oakland Army Base dock, clipboard pressed against his chest, watching the USS transport vessel cut through the grey water. At 28 years old, Wyatt stood 6'2", broad-shouldered from a lifetime of ranch work in the Texas Panhandle. His uniform was pressed sharp, his boots polished to a mirror shine. But his hands told the real story. These were working hands, calloused from barbed wire and cattle ropes and windmill repair across 2,000 acres of Morrison family land. Hands that had built fences in 100-degree heat. Hands that had pulled breech calves and branded steers and fixed tractors when mechanics couldn't get parts during the Depression. He had volunteered for this assignment, escorting Japanese prisoners of war from the California coast to Crystal City internment camp in Texas. Most of the other military police at Fort Sam Houston had turned it down. Nobody wanted to babysit enemy prisoners when real combat was happening in Europe and the Pacific. But Wyatt had reasons. Personal reasons that burned like mesquite coal in his chest every time he thought about December 7, 1941. About his best friend Marcus Webb, who went down with the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. About the newspaper photographs of American nurses captured in the Philippines, their faces hollow with starvation and abuse, forced to march through jungles while Japanese soldiers laughed. Today, Wyatt thought he would finally look the enemy in the eye. The transport ship's horn bellowed across the water, a sound that felt like it came from some prehistoric animal. Deckhands rushed to secure the mooring lines. Wyatt straightened his shoulders and moved toward the gangplank, flanked by 2 other military policemen. Corporal Rodriguez on his left, Private Jenkins on his right, both good men. Both wondering, like Wyatt, what kind of fanatics they were about to encounter. The ship's cargo hold door opened with a metallic screech that made gulls scatter from nearby pilings, and 47 Japanese women emerged into American sunlight for the first time. Reiko Nakamura was the 14th woman down the gangplank. At 23 years old, she weighed 91 pounds. Her Imperial Japanese Army nursing uniform, once crisp and proper, and a source of pride, now hung loose on her frame like a burial shroud. 3 years of war had carved away everything soft from her body. Her cheekbones stood sharp beneath skin stretched tight as rice paper. Her wrists were bird bones wrapped in flesh. But her eyes, those dark eyes, still burned with something fierce. Pride, maybe, or terror masquerading as courage. She had expected demons. The American propaganda her military commanders had shown before Saipan fell had promised barbaric monsters. Hands that steadied her without gripping too tight, without taking advantage of her weakness. Wyatt Morrison felt the woman's weight in his arms. 90 pounds, maybe less. Something in his chest twisted in a way he didn't expect and didn't want. This was the enemy, this terrified girl who flinched at his touch like he might strike her. He had psyched himself up for fanatics, for the monsters from the newsreels, for the Imperial Japanese soldiers who had bayoneted his best friend's body after the Arizona sank. Instead, he was catching a starving woman who looked like a strong wind might blow her into the bay. Her eyes met his for one electric second. Fear. That's what Wyatt saw. Pure animal fear. Not hatred, not fanaticism, just the primal terror of a prisoner who expected torture and was trying desperately not to show it. Something in that moment cracked open inside Wyatt Morrison. Some wall he'd been building brick by brick since Pearl Harbor. But he pushed it down, locked it away, stepped back to professional distance. "This way, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward the military buses waiting on the dock. Reiko didn't understand the English words, but she understood the gesture. She moved toward the bus with the other women, all of them silent, all of them scanning for the cruelty they'd been promised was coming. But the cruelty didn't come. Instead, they saw electric streetlights lining the Oakland dock, tall metal poles crowned with glass bulbs that would illuminate the darkness when night fell. Reiko had only seen electric streetlights in downtown Hiroshima before the war, and even there they were shut off most nights at 9 o'clock to conserve power for the war effort. Here in an enemy country at war, electric lights stood ready to burn all night long. The buses themselves were another shock. Large vehicles with cushioned seats and glass windows. Not the military trucks with wooden benches Reiko had expected. Not cattle cars. Not prison transports with bars. As she climbed aboard, she noticed the seats were clean. The floor was swept. There were no chains, no cages, just rows of seats facing forward like a public bus in peacetime Japan. The other women whispered among themselves in Japanese as they settled into seats. Yuki Tanaka, a 32-year-old teacher from Tokyo, sat beside Reiko and gripped her hand. "This doesn't match what we were told," Yuki whispered. Reiko nodded, unable to speak, because through the bus window as they pulled away from the dock, she could see San Francisco proper, and nothing, absolutely nothing, matched what she had been told. Buildings rose 10 stories, 12 stories, 15 stories into the sky. Concrete and steel towers that made Tokyo's tallest structures look modest by comparison. The streets were paved smooth with asphalt marked with painted lines, orderly and geometric. Cars filled every avenue, not military vehicles. Private automobiles owned by ordinary citizens. Reiko counted 12 cars in one intersection alone. In Hiroshima, her father's government office had owned 2 automobiles for the entire department of 43 people. And the people. American civilians walking the sidewalks in the middle of a war. They looked healthy, well-fed. The women wore colorful dresses made from fabrics that would have been considered luxury items in Japan. They carried leather handbags. They wore makeup and jewelry. One woman was actually laughing, as she walked with a young child who was eating something from a paper wrapper. Eating while walking, wasting food crumbs on the sidewalk without a care. Reiko pressed her face to the window, unable to look away. Wyatt Morrison, sitting in the front seat of the bus, watched the prisoners' reactions in the rearview mirror. He'd seen this before with German POWs, with Italian internees, the shock of American normalcy, of American abundance. But watching these Japanese women who had been fed such complete lies about American poverty, the shock seemed deeper somehow, almost painful. The convoy of 3 buses rolled through downtown San Francisco, and Wyatt made a decision. He leaned forward and spoke to the driver. "Take Market Street," he said, "then cut through the financial district." The driver glanced back, surprised. "That's the long way to the train station, Sarge." "I know," Wyatt said. "Take it anyway." So the buses turned onto Market Street, the wide boulevard that showcased American commercial prosperity like a museum display. Department stores with window displays full of goods, dresses and shoes and hats, furniture and radios and phonographs, restaurants with signs advertising steaks and seafood and prime rib, movie theaters with marquees announcing the latest films, and everywhere, electric signs powered by a grid that never seemed to shut down. Reiko's training as a nurse had taught her to observe carefully, to document details, to analyze evidence and draw conclusions based on what she saw, not what she wanted to see. So she observed, she documented in her mind, she analyzed, and slowly, terribly, she began to understand. If this was American poverty, what did that make Japan? The bus ride from Oakland to the San Francisco train station took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of cognitive dissonance so intense that Reiko felt physically ill. Every block contradicted another piece of propaganda. Every storefront demolished another lie she'd been taught to believe. By the time they arrived at the Southern Pacific Railroad depot, Reiko's entire understanding of the war had begun to fracture like ice under spring sun. The train itself was the final blow to her remaining certainty. A passenger train, not a prison transport. The cars had cushioned bench seats facing each other across small tables, windows that opened to let in fresh air. A dining car where she was told through a translator meals would be served during the 3-day journey to Texas. 3 days. California to Texas. Reiko had studied American geography during her nursing education. She knew intellectually how vast this country was. Larger than Japan. Much larger. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it physically were different things entirely. As the train pulled out of San Francisco Station at 3 that afternoon, Reiko settled into a window seat and prepared herself for a journey that would teach her more truth than she was ready to accept. Wyatt Morrison moved through the train car checking on the prisoners. His orders were clear. Treat them according to the Geneva Convention. Provide food, water, medical care as needed. Maintain security, but avoid unnecessary cruelty. He took those orders seriously, not because he liked the Japanese, not because he'd forgiven them for Marcus Webb bleeding out in the water at Pearl Harbor, but because he was a Morrison, and Morrisons did things right or not at all. His father had taught him that. Samuel Morrison, who had built the family ranch from nothing, who had survived the Depression without losing a single acre, who had raised 3 sons to believe that a man's character showed in how he treated those who couldn't fight back. Samuel Morrison had died in the spring of 1943, leaving Wyatt to run the ranch alone until his draft number came up. By the time Wyatt was cleared to enlist, the army didn't want him in combat. They wanted him in military police managing the flood of prisoners that were starting to arrive from both theaters of war. Wyatt had felt ashamed at first. His 2 older brothers were fighting Jacob with the Marines in the Pacific, Thomas with the army in Europe. Real combat, real glory. And here was Wyatt escorting prisoners and guarding camps. Consolation prize duty for men who couldn't cut it on the front lines. But then he remembered what his father had said the night before he died. They'd been sitting on the ranch house porch watching the sun set over the flat Texas plains, turning everything gold and orange and finally purple as night came on. Samuel had put his weathered hand on Wyatt's shoulder. His grip was weak. The cancer was eating his lungs, making every breath a labor. "Son," Samuel had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "War brings out the worst in men. Killing is easy when you're scared and angry. Any fool can pull a trigger when he's full of hate." Samuel had paused, gathering strength. "But mercy, Wyatt. Mercy when you have every right to be cruel. That's what separates civilized men from savages. You remember that whatever this war brings." So Wyatt walked through the train car distributing canteens of water to women who flinched when he approached. And he tried to see them the way his father would have wanted. Not as enemies, just as people. Scared, hungry, far from home people. The California landscape rolled past the windows as afternoon turned to evening. Farmland first, the vast agricultural valley that fed much of America. Reiko watched fields stretch to the horizon, each one larger than entire villages in Japan. She saw tractors, combines, mechanical harvesters, machines she had never imagined existed. In Japan, farming was done by hand, by families bent over rice paddies, by water buffalo pulling wooden plows through mud. Here, one farmer with one machine could harvest more grain than 100 Japanese farmers working all season. The industrial capacity required to build such machines, Reiko thought. The fuel to run them. The infrastructure to maintain them. The wealth to make them commonplace. This was not the primitive, resource-poor America of Japanese propaganda. This was something else entirely. As darkness fell, the electric lights inside the train car came on automatically, bright, clean light that didn't flicker or dim. Reiko had worked in a military hospital on Saipan that relied on candles and oil lamps for night operations because electricity was too precious to waste on medical care. Here, on a prisoner transport train, lights burned without a second thought. At 6:30 in the evening, the dining car opened for dinner service. Wyatt and the other MPS escorted the Japanese women to the dining car in groups of 10. Reiko was in the third group. She walked through the narrow corridor between cars, feeling the rhythmic sway of the train, and entered a space that looked like a restaurant. Tables covered with clean white cloths, proper plates and silverware, windows framing the darkening landscape, and American soldiers serving food from large metal pans, ladling portions onto each prisoner's plate with the same care they would show their own families. The meal was roast beef sandwiches, potato chips, apples, cookies, and milk. Reiko stared at her plate. The sandwich alone contained more meat than her family had eaten in a month. Thick slices of beef on soft white bread. The bread itself was a luxury pure wheat, no sawdust filler, no rice hulls mixed in to stretch the supply. Potato chips, crispy and salted, a snack food that hadn't existed in Japan since before the war. An apple, fresh and unblemished, probably from California orchards they'd passed earlier. Cookies, sweet and crumbly, made with real sugar and butter. And milk, cold milk in a glass bottle with condensation dripping down the sides. This was not prison rations, this was abundance. Around her, the other Japanese women sat frozen, staring at their food like it might be poisoned, or fake, or some kind of psychological torture designed to break their spirits. Wyatt noticed the hesitation. He'd expected this. The Germans and Italians had been suspicious too at first, but he'd learned that actions spoke louder than words, especially when language was a barrier. He picked up his own identical meal. The guards ate the same food as the prisoners, took a large bite of his roast beef sandwich and chewed slowly, making sure every prisoner could see him eating the same food. "It's not poisoned, ladies," he said, knowing most wouldn't understand his English, but hoping his actions would translate. Still, they didn't eat. Reiko understood more English than the others thanks to her medical training. She'd studied from American nursing textbooks smuggled into Japan before the war. Technical English, medical terminology, basic phrases. But understanding the words and accepting the reality were different things. To eat this food meant accepting enemy charity. It meant admitting dependence on captors. It meant in some fundamental way choosing survival over honor. The other women looked to her. Reiko was the youngest, but she had education, status as a nurse, some ability to communicate with the guards. They waited to see what she would do. Reiko looked down at the roast beef sandwich. She looked at Wyatt Morrison, who had returned to his own meal, not forcing the issue, but not backing down either. She looked at Yuki, whose eyes were filled with tears because the smell of food was so overwhelming after weeks of near starvation on the transport ship. And Reiko made a choice. She picked up the sandwich with both hands, took the smallest possible bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, fat, protein, flavor that her body recognized as life itself. Her stomach cramped violently, unused to real food after 3 years of deprivation. But she chewed, she swallowed, and in that moment something inside her began to shift. Around her, the other women began to eat, slowly at first, almost guilty, then faster as hunger overcame shame. Wyatt watched them eat and felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. These were not monsters. These were hungry women eating their first real meal in months, maybe years. What kind of government, he wondered, sends its people to war against a nation they cannot possibly defeat and lies to them about it the entire time? After dinner, the women returned to their passenger car. Some fell asleep immediately, exhausted by food and emotion. Others sat awake, staring out windows at the American darkness rushing past. Reiko couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with calculations, comparisons, questions that had no comfortable answers. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket. It had been a gift from her mother before Reiko left for nursing school, before the war, before everything changed. The first half was filled with medical notes, patient observations, treatment protocols. The back half was blank. Reiko began to write in Japanese in tiny characters to conserve paper. She documented everything she'd seen since arriving in America: the electric lights, the buildings, the cars, the food, the gentle hands that had caught her when she stumbled. If she survived this, someone needed to know the truth. The train rolled on through the night, carrying 47 Japanese women deeper into enemy territory, deeper into a reality that contradicted everything they'd been taught to believe. In the front of the car, Wyatt Morrison sat awake too, writing his own letter by the light of a reading lamp. "Dear Thomas," he wrote to his brother somewhere in Europe, "I'm escorting Japanese POWs to Texas, women mostly, nurses and civilian workers captured at Saipan." He paused, pen hovering over paper. "I know you'd hate me saying this, but they don't look like monsters. They look scared and hungry. Orders are to treat them well. Geneva Convention and all that." Another pause. "Part of me wants to make them suffer for what they did at Pearl Harbor, for what they did to Marcus. But I keep thinking about what Dad used to say. A man's character shows in how he treats those who can't fight back." Wyatt stared at the words he'd written. "These women can't fight back. They're prisoners. Does that make me weak? Tom, am I dishonoring Marcus's memory by not hating them enough?" He didn't know how to finish the letter. Didn't know what he was trying to say. Finally, he just wrote, "See you when this war is over. Your brother Wyatt." He folded the letter, knowing it wouldn't be mailed until they reached Crystal City, knowing his brother probably wouldn't understand. Hell, Wyatt barely understood himself. But something had changed in those first 12 hours. Something about catching a starving woman on a gangplank, about watching her cry while eating roast beef, something about looking into enemy eyes and seeing fear instead of hatred. The train carried them all eastward through the California night, toward Texas, toward Crystal City, toward a confrontation with truth that would change them in ways neither Wyatt Morrison nor Reiko Nakamura could yet imagine. Day 2 of the train journey began at dawn somewhere in Nevada. Reiko woke to find the landscape had changed completely. Desert now, vast and empty, stretching to mountains that looked like waves frozen in stone. She had never seen terrain like this. Japan was green, lush, crowded, mountains covered in forest valleys thick with rice paddies, every inch of usable land cultivated and occupied. This American emptiness was almost frightening in its scale. Like the country had so much space it could afford to leave entire states unpopulated. Around mid-morning on the second day, something happened that would crack both Wyatt's and Reiko's worldviews even wider. An elderly Japanese woman named Chio Fujimoto, 58 years old, collapsed in her seat. One moment she was looking out the window at the Nevada desert. The next she was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. The women around her cried out in Japanese, panic spreading through the car like wildfire. Reiko's nurse training kicked in instantly. She rushed to the woman's side, checking pulse, breathing, skin color. The symptoms were clear: severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible heat exhaustion from the desert sun streaming through the windows. "Help!" Reiko called out in English, her accent thick but the word clear. "Please, she need water medicine." Wyatt was in the next car when he heard the commotion. He ran back, pushing through the crowded aisle, and found Reiko kneeling beside the unconscious woman. "What happened?" he demanded. "She collapsed. No water enough, no food enough. She need doctor." Wyatt didn't hesitate. He grabbed the emergency medical kit, bolted to the wall, yanked out blankets, water, a first aid manual. He dropped to his knees beside Reiko. "Tell me what to do." And just like that, enemy became ally. Wyatt followed Reiko's instructions, holding the woman's head while Reiko slowly dripped water between her lips. They worked together, nurse and soldier, their hands touching as they turned the woman on her side, checked her breathing, monitored her pulse. Wyatt radioed ahead to the next station, Albuquerque, New Mexico. They would have a doctor waiting. For 20 minutes they worked to keep Chio Fujimoto alive. And in those 20 minutes, everything Wyatt thought he knew about the enemy dissolved. This Japanese nurse was good at her job, competent, caring. She spoke to the unconscious woman in soothing Japanese, even though the woman couldn't hear. She checked vitals with practiced efficiency. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she did it without hesitation. This was not a fanatic. This was a professional doing her duty. When the train pulled into Albuquerque station 90 minutes later, an army doctor was waiting. He boarded, examined Chio Fujimoto, and immediately started an IV drip. Fluids, vitamins, medication. "She's severely malnourished," the doctor said, looking at Wyatt with something close to accusation in his eyes. "How long has she been in your custody?" 2 days, Wyatt said. "She was like this when we picked her up in Oakland." The doctor's expression softened. "Then this is pre-existing. Probably been starving for months before capture." He looked at Reiko. "You did good work keeping her alive. Are you a nurse?" Reiko understood enough to nod. "Well, nurse," the doctor said through Corporal Brennan's translation, "you saved this woman's life today." After the doctor left, after Chio was stabilized and sleeping peacefully with the IV drip feeding life back into her veins, Wyatt and Reiko stood together in the narrow space between train cars. The desert landscape rushed past. The late afternoon sun turned everything gold. "You did good work," Wyatt said. "You're a real nurse." Reiko understood. She nodded, tired but proud. "You helped. Why?" she asked. "She is enemy." "She's a sick old lady," Wyatt said. "That's all that matters right now." Their eyes met, really met, for the second time since the Oakland dock, and in that moment both of them felt their certainties crack a little wider. For Reiko, the crack revealed this truth. Americans might not be demons after all. For Wyatt, the crack revealed this Japanese might not all be monsters. It was a small crack. But in the days to come, it would become a chasm. By mid-morning the next day, the train was crossing into Utah. Corporal Thomas Brennan came through the car with a clipboard, explaining through careful gestures and simple English the route they would take. California to Nevada, to Utah, to Colorado, to New Mexico, to Texas. 3 days covering more than 1,800 miles. Reiko listened and tried to comprehend a nation so vast that a 3-day train journey barely crossed it. The other women were beginning to talk more among themselves, comparing observations, sharing shock, questioning everything. Yuki leaned close to Reiko and whispered, "If America has all this, why did our leaders tell us they were weak?" It was the question they were all thinking, the question that had no good answer. "Because," Reiko whispered back, "no one would have supported the war if they knew the truth." The realization hung between them like poison gas. The train rolled on, through mountain passes and across high desert plateaus, through small towns with water towers and grain elevators, through landscapes so big it made Reiko feel like an insect, insignificant and crushable. By evening of the second day they had crossed into Colorado. The third morning brought them to Texas. The landscape announced itself before the train even crossed the border. The mountains of New Mexico gave way to flatness so absolute it seemed like the earth had been pressed smooth by God's own hand. Mesquite trees dotted the horizon, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air that blew through the open train windows carried the smell of dust and cattle, and something else Reiko couldn't name. Something that felt like space itself. This was Wyatt Morrison's country, his home. In 3 hours they would arrive at Crystal City, and these women would become residents of the camp he'd been guarding for the past 6 months. Part of him wondered how they would react when they saw it. The Germans and Italians had been shocked. But the Japanese, fed such complete lies about American poverty, would be devastated. Good part of him thought. The part that still carried anger about Pearl Harbor. But another part, the part that had grown louder since catching Reiko on the Oakland gangplank, since working with her to save Chio Fujimoto, wondered if devastating people who had already been lied to was really victory. The train pulled into Crystal City Station at 11:30 in the morning. The small Texas town shimmered in the September heat. Its main street was lined with businesses that looked prosperous despite the war. A hardware store, a grocery, a movie theater with a marquee advertising a film Reiko had never heard of. American flags hung from several storefronts, stirring in the hot breeze. But it was the internment camp itself, visible beyond the town's edge, that stopped Reiko's breath. White cottages arranged in neat rows, tree-lined streets with names painted on posts, children actually playing in a central square, a baseball field with a real backstop and bases, gardens with vegetables growing in organized plots, and everywhere a sense of normalcy that made no sense for a prison. The women pressed against the train windows, murmuring in Japanese. Their voices rose with confusion and disbelief. "This cannot be the prison," Yuki whispered. "It must be temporary," another woman said. "The real prison must be elsewhere." But Wyatt Morrison, overhearing their confusion through Corporal Brennan's translation, shook his head. "This is it, ladies," he said. "Welcome to Crystal City." They disembarked onto a platform where 3 military buses waited. But first, an official greeting. Major William Bradford, camp commander, stood in his crisp uniform, flanked by administrative staff and translators. At 52, Bradford had the bearing of a career military man who had seen one world war and refused to let the second one strip away his humanity. He waited until all 47 women were assembled on the platform, standing in the Texas sun, wilting in the heat, before he spoke. "Ladies," Bradford began, his voice carrying authority but not cruelty. "Welcome to Crystal City Internment Facility. You will be housed in family cottages, 4 women per unit. You will receive 3 meals daily, medical care, educational opportunities, and access to recreation facilities." Corporal Brennan translated, his voice steady despite the strangeness of the words. "You will be expected to maintain your living quarters and participate in camp activities. We operate under Geneva Convention standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. You will be treated with dignity and respect, and we expect the same from you in return." The Japanese women listened with expressions ranging from suspicion to bewilderment. One of the older women, emboldened by confusion, raised her hand. Through the translator, she asked the question they were all thinking. "Where are the cells? Where is the real prison?" Bradford's expression didn't change. "This is the prison, ma'am. We don't use cells for non-combatant internees. You'll live in cottages with basic amenities. Your freedom of movement will be restricted to the camp boundaries, but within those boundaries you may move freely." The answer satisfied no one, because it made no sense. Prisons had bars, chains, punishment cells. This place had cottages and trees and children playing. The buses took them deeper into the camp. Reiko sat by a window, her medical training pushing her to observe and document, even as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She noted the layout. 290 acres, large enough to hold 3,500 internees. Japanese, German, and Italian families, all living in separate sections, but sharing common facilities. The cottages were simple wood-frame structures painted white, each with a small front porch. They looked like something from an American neighborhood, not a prison camp. Laundry hung on lines between some cottages. A woman, clearly German from her appearance, was sweeping her front step. Another Italian, perhaps, was tending a small flower garden. This was not incarceration. This was relocation. Wyatt watched Reiko's face as the bus rolled through the camp. He'd seen this expression before with other enemy prisoners. The moment when they realized that American imprisonment was better than freedom in their home countries. It was a devastating realization, one that stripped away the last vestiges of national pride and replaced it with confusion and shame. He should have felt satisfied. This was proof of American superiority. But watching Reiko's eyes fill with tears, Wyatt felt only pity. The buses stopped at the administrative building where processing would take place. Medical examinations first. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the camp's medical director, was a 48-year-old woman with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been a Methodist missionary in Tokyo in the 1920s, had learned Japanese while running a clinic for the poor, and had returned to the United States in 1937 when war clouds gathered. She examined each woman with clinical efficiency but genuine compassion. The physical examinations revealed what Wyatt had suspected. Nearly all the Japanese women showed signs of chronic malnutrition, low body weight, vitamin deficiencies, dental problems from lack of care. Several had early-stage beriberi from thiamine deficiency. 2 had untreated infections that required immediate treatment. Dr. Sullivan's notes, which would later become part of military intelligence reports, documented a pattern. These women, despite serving in military or government positions, had been living with severe resource shortages long before their capture. Japan was not just losing the war. Japan had been failing its own people for years. After medical processing came housing assignments. Wyatt had been assigned to escort the group that included Reiko to their cottage. Cottage number 23 in the Japanese section, shaded by a large mesquite tree. He carried the key and a clipboard listing the 4 women who would share the space: Reiko Nakamura, Yuki Tanaka, Harumi Sato, a 21-year-old communications clerk, and Michiko Yamada, a 34-year-old teacher. The 4 women stood on the porch while Wyatt unlocked the front door. None of them knew what to expect. Prison cells, surely. Concrete floors and metal bunks and a bucket for a toilet. Wyatt pushed the door open and stepped aside. "After you, ladies." They entered slowly, defensively, waiting for the trap. Instead, they found a home. The living room held a sofa, worn but clean, its cushions faded from sun but still intact. 2 armchairs flanked a small coffee table. A radio, an actual radio, sat on a shelf built into the wall. Windows with glass panes and curtains let in the Texas sunlight. An electric lamp stood on a side table, its cord running to an outlet in the wall. Reiko walked to the lamp, flipped the switch. Light flooded the room. She flipped it off, then on again, off, on. Electric power at the flip of a switch. In Japan, even in Hiroshima's city center, electricity was rationed, shut off for hours each day to conserve fuel for the war effort. Here, in a prison camp for enemies, power flowed continuously, endlessly, at the whim of anyone who wanted light. Yuki moved toward the kitchen like a woman in a dream. The small room held an electric stove with 4 burners, a sink with a faucet that promised running water, and against the far wall, humming softly, a refrigerator. She opened the refrigerator door. Cold air spilled out. The interior light came on automatically. Inside were basic supplies: milk, eggs, butter, vegetables. Not much, but more than most Japanese families had seen in months. Yuki closed the door, opened it again, touched the cold metal shelves, felt the mechanical hum through her fingertips. "This cannot be real," she whispered in Japanese. Harumi, the youngest, had found the bedrooms. 2 rooms each with 2 beds. Real beds with mattresses and pillows and clean sheets. Dressers for clothing. Closets with wooden hangers. Windows with screens to keep out insects. And Michiko, the eldest, had discovered the bathroom. She stood in the doorway staring, unable to process what she was seeing. A flush toilet, white porcelain connected to plumbing, a bathtub with a shower head, hot and cold water taps, a sink with a mirror, towels hanging on a rack, indoor plumbing, in a prison cottage, for enemies. Wyatt stood in the living room watching their reactions, feeling that crack in his chest widen into something close to pain. He'd been here 6 months. He'd seen this moment dozens of times with German and Italian internees, but it never got easier. Watching people realize that their own governments had lied to them about everything was like watching someone's faith die in real time. "Everything works," he said quietly to Reiko, who had circled back to the living room. "The electricity, the water, the stove, it's all functional." He cleared his throat. "Meals are served in the community dining hall at 7, noon and 6, but you can cook here too if you want. Ration credits will be provided each week for the commissary." Reiko opened her mouth, closed it. Too many questions, and none that she could articulate in English. Finally, she managed, "This is for us, 4 prisoners. Yes, ma'am. This is your housing for the duration of your internment. We can cook within reason. No sharp knives for security purposes. but cooking utensils, yes. There's a commissary where you can purchase additional food items with your credits. Reiko turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Because if she looked at him, she would have to acknowledge what this meant. She would have to face the truth that was crystallizing in her mind with brutal clarity. Her family's home in Hiroshima had never had indoor plumbing. They used a communal well for water and an outhouse for sanitation. Her father, a government bureaucrat, was considered middle class. Comfortable by Japanese standards, they had electricity in 2 rooms, shut off after 9 each night. They had never owned a refrigerator. Ice was delivered in blocks by a vendor who came twice a week in summer. And here in an American prison camp she had all of it. Running hot water, electricity without limits, a refrigerator that ran day and night, a flush toilet. Either American wealth was so vast that even prisoners lived like Japanese elites, or everything Japan had taught her about American poverty was a lie. She knew which answer was true. She'd known since San Francisco. But accepting it meant accepting that Japan had sent its people to die in a war against a nation so far ahead, technologically and economically, that defeat had been inevitable from the start. Wyatt cleared his throat again. "I'll let you all get settled. Dinner is at 6 in the main dining hall. Someone will come by to escort you." He moved toward the door. "If you need anything, there's a call button by the front door that connects to the administration building." He left before Reiko could formulate a response, closing the door softly behind him. The 4 women stood in their impossible cottage and tried to understand what this place meant. Yuki broke the silence first. "I need to test the water." She went to the kitchen sink and turned both taps. Water flowed instantly. The hot tap produced hot water within seconds. Steaming, clean hot water that ran and ran and ran without stopping. Yuki began to cry. Harumi tested the toilet, flushing it 3 times in succession, watching fresh water fill the bowl each time. Michiko sat on the sofa and pressed her face into her hands. And Reiko returned to the refrigerator, opened it, stared at the milk bottle. Fresh milk in glass, cold, available whenever they wanted it. Her mother's last letter received before the Saipan evacuation had mentioned that milk was no longer available in Hiroshima. The cows had been slaughtered for meat as food shortages worsened. Children were growing up without ever tasting milk. And here it sat, in a refrigerator, in a prison cottage, for enemies who were supposed to be suffering. That night, Reiko couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed in her shared bedroom, listening to Yuki's quiet breathing from the other bed. The mattress was soft. The pillow was real cotton, not stuffed with straw or rice husks. The sheet was clean and crisp. She had never been more comfortable in her life. She had never felt more ashamed. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and moved to the living room. She sat on the sofa in darkness, not wanting to turn on the electric light, not ready to accept that level of casual luxury. But through the window she could see streetlights burning all night long, illuminating the pathways between cottages, bright and steady and utterly wasteful by Japanese standards. Except it wasn't wasteful here. It was normal. Reiko pulled out her notebook and began to write by the ambient light from the street lamps. She wrote in Japanese, her characters small and precise, documenting everything: the cottage, the appliances, the plumbing, the electricity, the implications. She wrote, "If America has this much excess that even prisons are electrified and supplied with running water and refrigeration, then Japan never had a chance. We were fighting a nation so wealthy, so industrially advanced, that they can afford to treat enemies better than we treat our own citizens." She wrote, "Our government knew this. They had to know. You cannot plan a war against another nation without understanding their capacity, which means they sent us to fight knowing we would lose. They lied to us about American weakness because the truth would have prevented the war." She wrote, "I have been complicit in my own deception. I believed because believing was easier than questioning. I am ashamed." And then in English, practiced carefully, she wrote 4 more words. "I cannot go back. Because how could she return to Hiroshima, to her family, to her country, and pretend she hadn't seen the truth? How could she eat rice porridge and be grateful when she'd eaten roast beef? How could she use an outhouse when she'd experienced the dignity of indoor plumbing? The truth had poisoned her, made her unfit for the lies that held Japanese society together. Across the camp in the military police barracks, Wyatt Morrison sat at a small desk, unable to sleep either. He pulled out a piece of paper and began another letter to his brother Thomas. "Tom," he wrote, "I watched them see their cottage today. 47 women who expected cells and chains. Instead, they got refrigerators and flush toilets." His pen paused. "You should have seen their faces. Not grateful, not relieved, devastated, because they finally understood that their government lied to them about everything." Wyatt stared at the words. "It made me think about what we were told. About Japanese being fanatics who would never surrender. About them being subhuman monsters who enjoyed torturing prisoners. What if that was our lie? What if we needed to believe they were monsters so we could justify what we're doing to them?" He didn't know how to finish the thought. "I don't know anymore, Tom. I thought this duty would be simple. Guard the enemy, keep them contained, wait for the war to end. But it turns out the enemy is just people, scared, lied to people, and guarding them means watching them realize their whole world was built on propaganda." Wyatt signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope he would mail the next day. Then he lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, thinking about a Japanese nurse with sad eyes who looked at a refrigerator like it was evidence of a crime. The next morning would bring the moment that would become for both Wyatt and Reiko the turning point from which there could be no return. 6:30 in the morning. September 16th, 1944. The community dining hall opened for breakfast, and Reiko Nakamura would eat 6 strips of bacon that would destroy everything she had left to believe in. The smell hit her before she entered the hall. Salt, smoke, caramelization. Reiko stood outside the community dining hall at 6:30 in the morning, September 16th, 1944, and the smell of bacon frying reached her like a physical force, like a memory she'd never had, like a promise she couldn't trust. She hadn't eaten meat in 3 years. Back in Hiroshima, her mother was boiling tree bark to make soup. The doors to the dining hall stood open. Inside, she could see long tables arranged in rows, windows along one wall letting in the early morning light, and a serving line where civilian volunteers ladled food onto trays. Yuki touched her arm. "Are you ready?" Reiko nodded, unable to speak, unable to explain that she would never be ready for what was about to happen. They entered with the other women from their section, all of them moving slowly, uncertain, still adjusting to the camp's rhythms. The dining hall was large, designed to feed hundreds at once. German families sat at tables on one side, Italian families on another. The Japanese women newly arrived were directed to tables near the windows, but it was the serving line that held Reiko's attention. Mrs. Catherine Patterson stood behind the metal steam tables, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and efficient hands, a farm wife from Iowa who'd volunteered to help at the camp because, as she'd told Major Bradford, somebody's got to feed these people, and it might as well be done right. She treated every internee the same, German, Italian, Japanese. Each one received the same portions, the same neutral kindness, no judgment, no cruelty, just food served with practiced efficiency. Reiko moved through the line, holding her tray with both hands. Mrs. Patterson placed items on the tray without comment, without looking Reiko in the eye. Just steady mechanical service. 6 strips of bacon, thick cut. The edges dark and crispy, nearly black in places. The fat translucent and glistening, still hot from the griddle. The smell rising in waves that made Reiko's mouth water involuntarily. 3 scrambled eggs, fluffy, yellow gold from real yolks. Butter mixed in, steam rising, seasoned with salt and pepper. 2 pieces of toast, white bread, buttered, golden brown from the toaster. Hash brown potatoes, shredded and fried, crispy on the outside, tender inside, seasoned with salt and onion. A glass of orange juice, fresh squeezed, pulp visible. bright orange and cold. A cup of coffee, hot. Real coffee, not the barley tea substitute that had replaced it in Japan years ago. Black, unless she wanted cream and sugar, which were available at the end of the line in small glass containers. Reiko carried her tray to the table where Yuki and the others from Cottage 23 were sitting. She set it down carefully, as if the food might explode, as if touching it might trigger something irreversible. This meal, this single breakfast, represented more calories and nutrition than Reiko's family in Hiroshima had consumed in a week, maybe longer. Around her, the other women were frozen too, staring at abundance, confronting the final undeniable proof of everything they'd been trying not to accept. Wyatt Morrison walked past their table, not stopping, not staring, just maintaining presence. But he glanced at Reiko as he passed. Their eyes met for half a second. In that moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a shared understanding that what was about to happen was more than just eating breakfast. This was surrender, not military surrender, not the raising of white flags or the signing of documents, but something deeper, more personal, more devastating, the surrender of faith. Reiko picked up a strip of bacon. The texture registered first, crispy outside, but the fat underneath still soft, yielding. The heat radiated through her fingers, then the smell as she brought it close to her face. Salt, smoke, pork, richness her body recognized as life itself. She closed her eyes, and in that darkness behind her eyelids she saw her mother, Fumiko Nakamura, standing in their small kitchen in Hiroshima. Thin, so thin now, her cheekbones sharp, her hands trembling as she lifted a pot from the hibachi stove. Inside the pot tree bark, boiled until soft enough to chew. The water turned brown and bitter. No nutritional value, just bulk to fill empty stomachs, to trick the body into thinking it had eaten. Her mother ladling the bark soup into bowls. 3 bowls, one for herself, one for Reiko's father, one for Reiko's grandmother Hana. Her mother tasting the soup and grimacing at the bitterness, but eating it anyway, because there was nothing else. Reiko opened her eyes. She bit down on the bacon. The taste explosion was almost violent. Salt hit first, sharp, immediate, like a slap across her tongue, then fat, rich and coating, flooding her mouth, almost sweet in its intensity, then the smoke flavor underneath, like memory of fire, like something primal and ancient. Then the subtle caramelization from the Maillard reaction, the chemical magic that happens when meat meets heat, creating flavors that didn't exist in the raw ingredients. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. Her salivary glands opened. Her stomach contracted. Every cell in her body screaming, yes, this more life. But her mind was screaming something else entirely. Reiko swallowed the bacon, felt it slide down her throat, warm silk coating her esophagus, landing in her stomach like a stone. And the tears came. Not delicate tears, not polite Japanese tears hidden behind a hand. Full body-shaking sobs that she couldn't control, couldn't stop, couldn't hide. Around her, the other women began to cry too, as if Reiko's breaking had given them permission, as if they'd all been holding the same grief, and now it could finally escape. Yuki whispered in Japanese, her voice thick with tears. "We're eating better as prisoners than our families eat as free citizens." The words hung in the air like an accusation, like a confession, like a truth so painful it could barely be spoken. But Reiko didn't stop eating. She couldn't stop. Her body wouldn't let her stop. She ate the second strip of bacon, tasting every second, feeling the fat melt across her tongue, the salt crystals dissolving, the smoke flavor lingering in her sinuses. She ate the third strip, and with each bite she felt something inside her break and reform, like bones healing incorrectly, creating a new structure that would never quite fit the old shape. She ate the fourth strip, and thought about her grandmother Hana, who had raised Reiko when her mother worked, who had taught her to read using old newspapers and patience, who had sung folk songs about mountains and rivers and the eternal beauty of Japan. Grandmother Hana, who would die next month eating acorn soup, boiled acorns, bitter as medicine, toxic if not prepared correctly. But better than nothing. Better than starving without even the illusion of food. Reiko ate the 5th strip of bacon, and the guilt became physical, a nausea that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the betrayal of surviving while her family suffered. She ate the 6th strip, forcing herself, making herself taste every bite, feel every texture, acknowledge every flavor. Because if she was going to betray her family by accepting enemy food, by choosing survival over solidarity in suffering, then she would at least have the courage to feel it fully. She would not pretend this was easy, would not make it clean or simple or forgivable. She ate all 6 strips of bacon. Then she ate the 3 scrambled eggs, fluffy and rich with butter, tasting like luxury, like abundance, like everything Japan had told her America didn't have. She ate the 2 pieces of toast, white bread, pure wheat, no sawdust filler, buttered so heavily she could see teeth marks in the yellow fat. She ate the hash brown potatoes, crispy and salted and seasoned with real onions, not onion substitute made from fermented vegetables. She drank the orange juice, fresh squeezed, vitamin C flooding her system, preventing the scurvy that was starting to appear among Japanese civilians back home. She drank the coffee, real coffee, bitter and strong and caffeinated, not barley tea pretending to be coffee, not roasted dandelion root, not chicory. Coffee. And when she was finished, when her plate was empty and her stomach was full for the first time in 3 years, Reiko looked down at her hands. Hands that had held dying soldiers on Saipan. Hands that had administered medicine Japan couldn't provide. Hands that had just eaten 6 strips of bacon while her mother ate tree bark. She thought Japan has already lost this war. We lost it the moment we challenged a nation that feeds its enemies better than we feed our own people. And once that thought formed, once that truth crystallized, there was no unthinking it. The war for Reiko Nakamura was over, not officially. That would take 11 more months and 2 atomic bombs. But internally, personally, the war was over. She had surrendered to the truth. After breakfast, Reiko walked back to cottage 23 in silence. The other women gave her space, understanding perhaps that something had broken in her that couldn't be easily fixed. She went to her bedroom, closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at her hands. Hands that had just eaten 6 strips of bacon while her mother ate tree bark. 3 days ago on the transport ship, she had been Reiko Nakamura, Imperial Japanese Army nurse, loyal subject of the Emperor. Now she didn't know who she was. There was a knock on the cottage door. Yuki answered it. Reiko could hear voices from the bedroom. English, male. Wyatt Morrison's distinctive Texas drawl. "Morning, ma'am. Dr. Sullivan is requesting Miss Nakamura at the hospital. We've got an outbreak of influenza among the new arrivals. She needs a nurse who speaks Japanese." A pause. "Is she all right?" Yuki's response quiet. "She will be. Give her a moment." Reiko stood, straightened her uniform, took a breath. Then she opened the door and stepped back into her new reality. Wyatt stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, his face carefully neutral, professional, but his eyes held something else. Understanding, maybe, or pity. "Dr. Sullivan needs you at the hospital, ma'am. Influenza outbreak. Several of the women from the transport ship are showing symptoms. She needs someone who can translate. Explain the treatment protocols." Reiko nodded. "I come." Her English was halting, accented, but comprehensible. "I get my bag." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with the small medical kit she'd managed to keep through the evacuation of Saipan. Bandages, a stethoscope, thermometer, sutures, the basic tools of her trade. Wyatt waited while she gathered her things. Then he walked beside her through the camp toward the hospital building, maintaining proper distance, several feet apart, professional protocol. But the silence between them felt less hostile than it had on the train, more contemplative. Halfway to the hospital, Wyatt stopped at the canteen, a small building with a Coca-Cola sign in the window. "Thirsty?" he asked. "It's hotter than hell today, even for September." Reiko hesitated. Accepting gifts from her guard felt dangerous, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But the day was hot, and the walk was long, and she was tired of resisting every small kindness like it was a trap. She nodded. Wyatt disappeared inside and emerged a minute later with 2 glass bottles of Coca-Cola, condensation already forming on the cold glass. He showed her how to use the bottle opener attached to the canteen wall. The cap came off with a metallic pop and a hiss of escaping carbonation. He handed her the open bottle. "First Coke?" he asked. She nodded again, not trusting her English for more complex responses. Wyatt gestured to a bench in the shade of a mesquite tree. "Let's sit a minute. No rush." They sat, still maintaining proper distance, but together nonetheless. Reiko raised the bottle to her lips and took her first sip of Coca-Cola. The experience was a shock to her system. Cold. So cold it almost hurt, like drinking winter. Sweet. Sweeter than anything she'd tasted in years. Sugar rationed in Japan since 1941. Candy, a memory from childhood. Fizzy. The carbonation tickling and burning her throat in a way that was almost painful but not quite. And the flavor. Complex. Indefinable. Nothing like tea or water or the fermented beverages she was accustomed to. She must have made a face because Wyatt chuckled. "Takes some getting used to," he said, "but on a hot day, nothing beats it." Reiko took another sip, smaller this time, letting the strange beverage roll across her tongue. The sweetness was overwhelming. In Japan, sugar had been rationed since the war began. Desserts were made with saccharin, with honey when available, with nothing when supplies ran out. And here was a drink, a casual everyday drink. That was pure liquid sugar. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their Coca-Colas, the late morning sun painting everything in shades of gold and dust. Finally, Wyatt asked the question that had been building in him since the Oakland dock. "What did they tell you about Texas, about America?" Reiko was quiet for a long time, searching for English words, afraid to speak the truth out loud. "They told us," she said slowly, carefully, "that Americans were poor, living in wood houses, no electricity, little food, that your country was weak, divided, that you would surrender quickly because Americans love comfort more than honor." She paused, took another sip of Coke. "They told us you were barbarians, that you tortured prisoners, that you were cruel and savage and technologically backward." Wyatt laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitter recognition. "My family are ranchers," he said. "Not rich by American standards. Middle class, I guess. But we've had electricity since I was a boy, since 1932. Running water since 1928. Telephone since before I was born." He took a long drink of his Coke. "We ate 3 meals a day even during the Depression when banks were failing and farms were foreclosing. We never went hungry, never went without heat in winter or light at night." Reiko did the mental calculation. Electricity in rural Texas since the early 1930s. Japan, even in cities, still had spotty electrical service in 1944. "Your family had electricity in 1930s?" she asked, needing to confirm she'd understood correctly. "In the 30s, yeah. Rural areas were slower to get it than cities, but most of Texas was wired by the mid-30s. The gap was even wider than she'd thought." Reiko looked at the Coca-Cola bottle in her hand, at the casual American luxury she was consuming without a second thought. "We were told lies," she said quietly, the admission costing her something vital. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "I figure your government couldn't tell you the truth. Nobody would have supported the war if they knew." Reiko turned to look at him, really look at him. "You were told lies too," she said, "about Japanese people." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Oh yeah. We were told you were all fanatics, that you'd never surrender, that you tortured prisoners and committed atrocities without remorse, that you were basically monsters in human form." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And now," he said, "I'm drinking soda with a Japanese nurse who cries when she eats bacon because it reminds her that her mother is starving." The honesty hung between them, naked and dangerous. "You don't seem like a monster to me," Wyatt finished quietly. Reiko felt something in her chest crack open, some final defense she'd been maintaining, some last wall between enemy and human. "My mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last letter before Saipan. She said food is short, rice mixed with other things, but still they eat." She couldn't bring herself to say more, couldn't admit that she didn't know if her family was even still alive. "And I ate 6 pieces of bacon this morning," she said instead. The guilt in her voice was crushing, physical, like carrying stones. "That's not your fault," Wyatt said firmly. "Then whose fault is it?" Reiko asked. "My government that started this war. Your government that treats prisoners better than Japan treats citizens, or mine for eating the bacon anyway." Wyatt had no answer. They sat in silence, finishing their Coca-Colas as the sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter. Finally, Wyatt stood. "We should get to the hospital. Dr. Sullivan will be waiting." Reiko stood too, but before they started walking, she said one more thing. "What happens when war ends to us?" "You'll be repatriated," Wyatt said, "sent back to Japan, to your families." "To a country that lied to me," Reiko said. "To a family that believes I suffered torture here, while I gained weight eating American food." She paused. "You think I can tell them the truth?" Wyatt thought about it, really thought about it. "I think they won't believe you," he said honestly. "Or if they do believe, they'll hate you for accepting enemy kindness, for eating when they starved, for living comfortably while they suffered." Reiko nodded. She'd known this, but hearing it confirmed made it real. "So I am trapped," she said, "between two worlds, too corrupted by American truth to ever fully return to Japanese lies, too Japanese to ever be accepted as American." "That's not fair to you," Wyatt said. "Fairness is not relevant in war, only survival, only duty. What is your duty now to Japan, to the truth, to yourself?" Reiko didn't answer, because she didn't know anymore. They walked the rest of the way to the hospital in silence, guard and prisoner, American and Japanese, two people trying to make sense of a senseless war. The hospital occupied a converted recreation hall, its walls now lined with medical equipment that would have been extraordinary in most civilian facilities, let alone a prison camp. Reiko stepped inside and stopped breathing. X-ray machine, modern surgical suite, pharmacy stocked with drugs she'd only read about in outdated textbooks, blood storage refrigeration, sterilization equipment, examination rooms with proper lighting and ventilation. This prison camp hospital had better equipment than the military hospital in Hiroshima where she'd trained, better than the field hospital on Saipan where she'd treated dying soldiers with nothing but bandages and prayer. The X-ray machine alone represented technology she'd only seen in photographs. Dr. Margaret Sullivan appeared from her office, chart in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up and smiled at Reiko with genuine warmth. "Miss Nakamura, thank you for coming. We desperately need help with the Japanese patients." Many are frightened of American medical procedures. Having someone who speaks their language and understands their concerns will make treatment much easier. Corporal Brennan translated. His Japanese was textbook perfect, but lacking the nuance of natural speech. Reiko nodded. "I help however I can, Doctor." "Excellent. Let me show you what we're working with." The tour took 30 minutes. Each piece of equipment was a revelation. Each supply closet full of medicines was a condemnation. Dr. Sullivan showed her the pharmacy shelves stocked with medications Reiko had never seen. "These are sulfonamide drugs," Dr. Sullivan explained, holding up a bottle of white pills. They treat bacterial infections that would have been fatal just 10 years ago. We use them routinely now. She paused, reading Reiko's face through Corporal Brennan's translation. Do you have these in Japan? Reiko shook her head, shame burning in her chest. What did you use to treat infections in your hospital? Traditional medicines mostly. Herbs. If infection was very bad, sometimes we amputate to save life. Dr. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. These drugs could have saved many of your patients. I'm sorry you didn't have access to them. The apology coming from an enemy doctor to an enemy nurse was almost unbearable. Wyatt, standing near the door maintaining his security presence, heard the exchange and felt something twist in his gut. The first patient arrived 10 minutes later, a woman named Keiko Suzuki, suffering from influenza. Her breathing was labored, her fever high, her cough wet and productive. In Japan, this would likely lead to pneumonia, a potential death sentence especially for someone weakened by malnutrition. Dr. Sullivan examined her, listened to her lungs through a stethoscope, and made her diagnosis quickly. Bacterial pneumonia, secondary infection from the flu. We'll start her on sulfonamide immediately, and if she doesn't respond in 24 hours, we'll try penicillin. Penicillin. The miracle drug Reiko had only read about. Discovered in 1928, mass-produced by America during the war, unavailable in Japan. Reiko translated for Keiko, explaining the treatment. The woman gripped Reiko's hand and asked in Japanese if she could trust American medicine. Yes, Reiko said, looking at the vial of sulfonamide in Dr. Sullivan's hand. You can trust it. It is better than what we had in Japan. The admission felt like another betrayal. But it was true. Within 6 hours, Keiko's fever began to break. Within 24 hours, her breathing had eased significantly. Within 3 days, she was well enough to return to her cottage. It was a miracle. A routine, everyday American miracle that would have been impossible in Japan. Reiko watched the recovery and felt her last defenses against the truth dissolve completely. She could no longer pretend this was American propaganda or strategic deception. This was simply superior medical science applied with competence and care to people who were supposed to be enemies. And it meant that hundreds, maybe thousands of her patients on Saipan had died not from their wounds but from lack of medicine that America had in abundance. By the time October arrived, Reiko had settled into a routine: morning shift at the hospital, afternoon rest, evening meals in the dining hall or cooked in the cottage, nights writing in her diary by streetlight. She had gained 8 pounds, 91 to 99, 8 pounds of guilt, 8 pounds of American food. Wyatt escorted her to and from the hospital each day. Their conversations grew longer, more honest, less guarded. They discovered they both loved the night sky, the vast Texas darkness unpolluted by city lights. Stars so bright and numerous they looked like spilled salt. They discovered they both valued competence over ideology. Doing the job right mattered more than doing the job for the right side. They discovered they both carried impossible grief. Wyatt for Marcus Webb at Pearl Harbor, Reiko for patients she couldn't save on Saipan. They were becoming something neither of them had expected. Not friends exactly. The power imbalance was too great, the war too present. But allies, witnesses, two people who had seen through the propaganda and couldn't unsee it. One evening in late October, after Reiko's shift at the hospital, Wyatt walked her back to her cottage, and they stopped, as they often did now, to look at the stars. "Do you think about after?" Wyatt asked. "When the war ends?" "Every day," Reiko said. "I think about going home, about telling them what I saw here, about trying to help rebuild." "Will they let you? After you've been a prisoner?" "I do not know. In Japan, to be captured is shame. To survive as prisoner is greater shame. They may not want me back." She looked at him. "What about you? What will you do after?" "Go back to the ranch, I guess. Raise cattle, fix fences, try to forget." "You will not forget," Reiko said. "None of us will forget." "No," Wyatt agreed. "I don't suppose we will." They stood in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Two people from different worlds brought together by a war that had lied to them both, and neither of them knew that in 6 weeks everything would change again, that a letter would arrive that would break whatever remained of Reiko's faith in her government, that she would have to choose between honor and truth, and that the choice would cost her everything. The letter arrived on December 3rd, Red Cross mail delivery, the first communication from Japan in nearly 3 months. Thin envelopes distributed by camp administrators to internees gathered in the main hall. Names called out in alphabetical order. Nakamura, Reiko. She held the envelope in both hands. Rice paper. So thin she could see the shadow of writing through it. The handwriting on the front was shaky, uncertain, nothing like her mother's usual precise characters. That alone told Reiko something terrible had happened. She didn't open it in the hall, couldn't bear to read whatever was inside while surrounded by other people, other grief, other revelations. She carried it back to Cottage 23, waited until the others had gone to lunch, sat on the sofa in the living room with winter sunlight streaming through the windows, and opened her mother's letter. "My dear Reiko," it began, "we pray you are enduring terrible suffering with courage befitting a daughter of Japan. The military officer who visits our neighborhood tells us that American prisoners are tortured, starved, beaten, worked to death in mines deep underground where sunlight never reaches. We are proud that you suffer for the Divine Emperor. Your pain has meaning. Your sacrifice honors our family." Reiko looked around the cottage, at the electric lamp, at the radio on the shelf, at the door to the kitchen where the refrigerator hummed its constant mechanical song. She looked down at her body, at the weight she'd gained. 91 pounds in September, 99 pounds now in early December, 8 pounds of guilt, 8 pounds of American food. She kept reading. Conditions in Hiroshima worsen each day. Rice rations have been cut again. Now 180 grams per day mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. The sawdust makes it difficult to digest. Your father has stomach pains constantly, but we are grateful to have anything at all. 180 grams, less than 7 ounces, of rice mixed with sawdust. Reiko had eaten 6 strips of bacon that morning, plus eggs, plus toast, plus potatoes. Your father's munitions factory was destroyed by B-29 bombing on November 7th. The Americans came in daylight. Over 100 planes. The factory burned for 2 days. Your father survived because he was in the administrative building when the bombs fell. But he has no work now, no income. We survive on what savings remain. Her father's factory destroyed, her father unemployed, her family living on savings that couldn't last forever, while Reiko earned credits at the camp commissary for her nursing work. Credits she could spend on chocolate and cigarettes and toiletries. She kept reading, even though she knew what was coming, could feel it in the shakiness of the characters, in the spaces between words where her mother's pen had hesitated. Grandmother Hana died on October 22nd. The words hit like a physical blow. Grandmother Hana, who had raised Reiko when her mother worked, who had taught her to read using old newspapers and patience, who had sung folk songs about mountains and rivers and the eternal beauty of Japan. Dead. The doctor said it was malnutrition and hypothermia. We had no coal to heat the house, no wood, no fuel of any kind. The government requisitioned everything for the war effort. Grandmother died in her sleep during a cold night. The doctor said it was a small mercy, that she felt no pain. Reiko's hands shook. The paper trembled, but she kept reading. I boiled acorn soup yesterday. It took 3 hours to leach out enough tannins to make them edible. The soup is bitter as medicine, but it fills the stomach. It keeps us alive 1 more day. Acorn soup. Boiled acorns. Toxic if not prepared correctly. Bitter, barely digestible, but better than nothing. While Reiko drank fresh squeezed orange juice every morning. Our neighbor, Mrs. Yamada, was arrested last week. The Kempeitai took her in the night. Her crime was complaining about the food shortage at a neighborhood association meeting. No one knows where she was taken. Her family has heard nothing. arrested for complaining about starvation, disappeared by military police, while Reiko sat in a cottage with indoor plumbing and unlimited electricity. We believe you are suffering greatly for Japan, for the Emperor, for victory. Your pain is not meaningless. We endure together in spirit, even though we are separated by this cruel war. Be strong, my daughter. Your suffering has purpose. The letter was signed, Your loving mother, Fumiko Nakamura. Reiko read it 3 times. Then she looked at the lunch someone had left for her on the kitchen table. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, dinner roll, milk in a glass bottle. Grandmother Hannah died eating acorns. Reiko was gaining weight, eating chicken. She walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and vomited, not from sickness, from guilt so profound it became physical, became something her body couldn't contain anymore and had to expel like poison. When the retching stopped, she flushed the toilet, watching the evidence disappear, clean water washing away her shame. She washed her face, hot water from one tap, cold from the other, both instantly available, both endless. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. That evening, Wyatt found her sitting outside the cottage. The December air was cool, but not cold. Texas winters were mild compared to what she'd known in Japan. She sat on the porch step, the letter clutched in her hand, her eyes red from crying. Wyatt didn't ask permission, just sat down beside her, maintaining proper distance but offering presence. "Bad news from home?" he asked quietly. Reiko handed him the letter without speaking. He read it slowly, his face draining of color as he progressed through the careful characters that Corporal Brennan had translated into English on a separate sheet. When he finished, he folded both papers carefully and handed them back. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice rough. "Christ, I'm so sorry." "She died eating acorns," Reiko said, her voice flat, empty. "I ate 6 pieces of bacon this morning." "Reiko, my mother believes I am being tortured. She needs to believe that. It gives meaning to their suffering. If she knew the truth that I live better as prisoner than she lives as free citizen, it would destroy her." Wyatt had no response, because Reiko was right. Sometimes the truth was more cruel than lies. They sat in silence as darkness fell, as the streetlights came on automatically, powered by the endless American electricity that mocked every privation Reiko's family endured. "What will you do?" Wyatt finally asked. "When the war ends?" "I do not know. Tell the truth, maybe. Try to help rebuild. Try to make sense of what I learned here." "That's going to be hard, being the one who knows uncomfortable truths." "Yes, but lying is harder now. You in this place destroyed my ability to accept comfortable propaganda. Now I must live with truth, even when it hurts." Wyatt pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, offered her one. She shook her head. He lit one for himself, the match flare briefly illuminating his face in the darkness. "For what it's worth," he said, exhaling smoke, "I think you're brave. Taking in the truth when lies would be easier. That takes courage." "It does not feel like courage. It feels like betrayal." "Maybe they're the same thing sometimes. In war." They sat together until the night grew cold and the stars came out in their millions. And neither of them knew that in 2 weeks, Reiko would face her greatest test yet. December 18th brought a confrontation Reiko had been dreading. Colonel Harumi Sato called a meeting in her cottage. 25 women attended. The hardliners, the ones who refused to accept American kindness, who saw survival as surrender. Colonel Sato was 58, a former government official from Tokyo, a woman who had built her entire identity on Japanese superiority and American barbarism. And now that identity was crumbling like wet paper. She stood at the front of her crowded living room and spoke with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This Christmas celebration is propaganda," she declared. "They fatten us like livestock before slaughter. They give us comfort and food and gifts. They want us to forget we are Japanese, to betray our culture, to abandon our emperor. We must refuse. We must maintain our dignity through resistance. Several women nodded. The appeal to dignity, to cultural preservation, was powerful, but Reiko, standing near the back, raised her hand. With respect, Colonel Sato, is accepting a gift truly betrayal? Is learning about American customs abandoning our identity? Sato's eyes narrowed. You have been corrupted, Nakamura, working with that American guard Morrison, eating their food, using their medicine. You have forgotten what it means to be Japanese. I have not forgotten, Reiko said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. But I have learned what it means to survive. Survival through collaboration is still betrayal. These Americans treat us better than our own government did. Perhaps instead of rejecting their kindness out of pride, we should learn from it. The room erupted. Traitor! Sato spat. You shame Japan with your weakness. Other women began arguing. The room split. Voices rose in anger and fear and confusion. My grandmother died eating acorns, Reiko said loudly, cutting through the noise. Not because Americans killed her, because our government lied to us about a war we could never win. The room fell silent. We eat bacon while our families eat bark, Reiko continued. That is the truth, the cruel, undeniable truth, and we can refuse to eat out of pride. We can starve ourselves in solidarity. But that will not change what our government did to us. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. I choose to live, not to betray Japan, but to carry the truth home when this war ends, so that maybe we can build something better from the ashes of these lies. Yuki stood up beside Reiko. I also choose to live. Then another woman, then another. The room divided. 18 women with Sato, 29 with Reiko. Sato's face twisted with rage and grief. You will regret this. When we return home, when our people learn what you did, you will wish you had starved with honor. Perhaps, Reiko said quietly, but I will be alive to face that judgment. Christmas Day arrived with surprising Texas warmth. 70 degrees under blue sky, a gift from weather that knew no war. The dining hall had been transformed. A Douglas fir tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments contributed by German, Italian, and Japanese internees. Paper chains, folded cranes, carved wooden angels. A strange hybrid of traditions forced together by circumstance. Tables were pushed together to create one long communal space. Major Bradford's vision made real. Germans beside Italians, beside Japanese, beside American staff. An impossible gathering made possible only by the strange reality of Crystal City. The menu was pure American Christmas abundance. Roast turkey, 20 birds prepared in the camp kitchens, golden and glistening, carved at serving stations by volunteers, the smell filling the hall like incense. Sage stuffing, rich with butter and herbs and bread that had seen no sawdust filler. Mashed potatoes, mountains of them, gravy that flowed like rivers, cranberry sauce, tart and sweet simultaneously, fresh dinner rolls, still warm from the oven, and for dessert, pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Reiko sat with Yuki and the others who had chosen to attend. 29 Japanese women out of 47. The other 18 remained in their cottages, Sato's faction, maintaining protest through absence. Wyatt sat several tables away but could see Reiko clearly through the crowded hall. He watched as the servers placed food on her plate, watched as she stared at the turkey like it might come alive, watched as the first tears began to fall. She stood abruptly, walked outside, into the warm December air. Wyatt followed, maintaining proper distance, but concerned. He found her behind the community center, standing in the shade, crying silently. Hey, he said gently, talk to me. I cannot do this anymore, Reiko said, her voice breaking. I cannot eat their food and smile while my family dies. I cannot celebrate while my grandmother is buried in unmarked grave. I cannot pretend this is acceptable. You're not pretending, Wyatt said. You're surviving. Survival feels like betrayal. Every meal, every comfortable night in that cottage. Every moment I am not suffering, I am betraying my family. Wyatt stepped closer, breaking protocol, driven by something he couldn't name. "Your family wouldn't want you dead," he said firmly. "They do not know I am living like this. They think I suffer. They need to think I suffer, or my capture has no meaning. Then maybe after the war, you show them something different. You show them that surviving is not shameful, that there is another way besides suffering for honor." Reiko looked at him, this American soldier who had somehow become the only person who understood her impossible position. "You think that is possible? Changing an entire culture's relationship to suffering?" "I think you're already changed," Wyatt said. "And maybe that's enough. One person at a time, one truth at a time, building something new from the ashes of lies." They stood there in the Texas December, enemy soldier and enemy prisoner, separated by war but connected by something deeper, understanding. Recognition that they were both trapped in circumstances beyond their control, both trying to do right in a world that made rightness nearly impossible. "Okay," Reiko said finally. "I will go back inside. I will eat the turkey. I will survive." She paused, not to betray Japan, but to carry truth home when war ends, so that someone remembers, so that someone can say, "This is what happened, this is what we learned, this is what must never happen again." Wyatt smiled. "Just a little. That sounds like a good reason to survive." They walked back together, guard and prisoner, American and Japanese, two people trying to find meaning in the wreckage of certainty. Inside the hall, Reiko sat down at her table, looked at the turkey on her plate, and in that moment, a series of images flashed through her mind, intercutting like a film reel, memory and imagination bleeding together. Her mother in Hiroshima, stirring a pot of bark soup, steam rising, bitter smell filling the small kitchen. Reiko's fork touching the turkey, the meat warm and tender. Her grandmother dying in the cold, no fuel for heat, breath forming clouds in the unheated room. Reiko cutting the first piece, the knife sliding through, gravy pooling. Her father sitting in the rubble of his destroyed factory, unemployed, hopeless. Reiko bringing the fork to her mouth. Somewhere in the Pacific on Tinian Island, American airmen preparing B-29 superfortresses for missions to Japan. Cities burning, civilians dying, the war grinding toward its terrible conclusion. Reiko chewing, swallowing. The turkey was delicious, rich, savory, everything food should be, and every bite was agony. But she ate, slowly, methodically, forcing herself to taste every second, to feel every texture, to acknowledge the full weight of survival. She ate the turkey and thought about bark soup. She ate the stuffing and thought about sawdust rice. She ate the potatoes and thought about acorn bitterness. She ate the cranberry sauce and thought about Grandmother Hana dying of cold and starvation. She ate the dinner roll and thought about arrested neighbors disappearing into Kempeitai prisons. She ate the pumpkin pie and thought about a war that was already lost, but would grind on for 8 more months, killing hundreds of thousands more, burning cities, vaporizing civilians, all because no one could admit the truth that she'd learned in September, that Japan had never had a chance, that the war was lost before it began, that everything, every death, every sacrifice, every act of suffering had been for nothing except the pride of men who couldn't admit they were wrong. When she finished eating, Reiko sat back in her chair and wrote one sentence in her mental diary. "Eating turkey while thinking of bark soup. This is what war did to me. Made me someone who can hold 2 truths at once, gratitude and guilt, hope and grief, life and death." The dining hall around her buzzed with multilingual conversation, children laughing, adults finding temporary peace, enemies breaking bread together because circumstance had made them neighbors. And Reiko understood something fundamental. This was not weakness. This was not betrayal. This was the only victory that mattered. Not military victory, not conquest or surrender or treaties signed in blood, but human victory. The victory of choosing life over death, truth over lies, survival over honor, suicide. The war still had 8 months to run. 8 months of island hopping and firebombing. 8 months of desperation and approaching defeat. 8 months until the morning of August 6, 1945. Reiko was working in the Crystal City Hospital when the news came through military channels. A single bomb, a city erased, 70,000 dead in an instant, maybe more. The name of the city, Hiroshima. She didn't scream, didn't cry. Just walked outside and sat on the hospital steps. Wyatt found her there 3 hours later, still sitting, still silent. He sat beside her, said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The letter from the Red Cross arrived 6 weeks later, official, clinical, confirming what she already knew. Fumiko Nakamura, mother, deceased, August 6, 1945. Immediate blast zone. Father, deceased, August 9, 1945. Radiation sickness. Cottage destroyed. No survivors. The war ended on August 15th. Victory for America. Unconditional surrender for Japan. And Reiko Nakamura sat in a Texas prison camp, alive and well-fed and empty. Reiko boarded a transport ship in San Francisco Harbor. Repatriation. Return to Japan. Weight 116 pounds. 25 pounds heavier than when she'd arrived. 25 pounds of survival. 25 pounds of guilt. 25 pounds of American food that had kept her alive while her family burned. Wyatt came to see her off. Against regulations. But Major Bradford looked the other way. They stood on the dock. The same dock where he'd caught her when she stumbled 13 months ago, a lifetime ago. "What will you tell them?" Wyatt asked. "When you get home." "The truth," Reiko said. "All of it. The bacon, the cottage, the refrigerator, the kindness that was crueler than cruelty." "Will they believe you?" "No, but I will be the witness, and witnesses don't lie." She held out her hand. Western style, American style. Wyatt shook it, gentle, careful, the way he'd caught her that first day. "Goodbye, Sergeant Morrison. Goodbye, Miss Nakamura. I hope you find peace." "Peace," she said, "is not for people like us. We know too much." The ship's horn bellowed. She turned and walked up the gangplank without looking back. Wyatt watched until the ship disappeared into the fog. Reiko Nakamura sat at a small desk in a small apartment. 78 years old, alone. Her hands shook as she wrote. Arthritis, age, memory. "Dear Sergeant Morrison," she began in careful English, "if you still live, if this letter finds you, I have carried this weight for 55 years. The bacon, the turkey, the kindness that destroyed my faith but saved my life. Mother and father died in the fire you call Little Boy. I survived in Texas eating your food. I told them. After the war, I told everyone. The refugees, the survivors, the students who asked about the camps. They didn't believe me. They said I was brainwashed, corrupted, a traitor who accepted enemy comfort. But I kept telling, because you taught me surviving is not betraying. Witnessing is duty. Thank you for that lesson. I hope you found peace that I could not." Reiko Nakamura, March 2000. She sealed the envelope, addressed it to Wyatt Morrison, Crystal City, Texas, USA, posted it the next morning. The letter returned. Stamped in red, "Deceased, returned to sender." Reiko held the unopened envelope and cried for the first time since Hiroshima burned. Not for her family. She'd cried those tears long ago, but for Wyatt Morrison, the enemy who had shown her mercy, who had taught her that truth mattered more than pride. Gone now, like everything else. Reiko Nakamura died in her sleep. Peaceful, quiet, alone. Her landlord found her 3 days later, and found the diary. A small notebook, half filled with medical notes in Japanese, half filled with observations in Japanese and English. The first entry, September 15th, 1944. The last entry, November 2000. The landlord, not knowing what else to do, contacted the Japanese consulate, who contacted the American embassy, who contacted the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The diary of Reiko Nakamura was donated to the permanent collection. Filed under Japanese-American Relations, Crystal City Internment Camp, Personal Narratives. The museum archivist opened it carefully. Decades-old paper. Fragile ink. The first page, dated September 16, 1944, written in neat Japanese characters with English translation in the margin. Today I ate 6 strips of bacon. It tasted like the death of everything I believed. Pressed between the pages, a faded Red Cross letter dated December 1944, from her mother, and a photograph, black and white, creased, faded. 47 Japanese women standing in front of a white cottage in Texas. September 1944. In the back row, 14th from the left, a young woman, 23 years old, 91 pounds, eyes that burned with something fierce. Reiko Nakamura. The museum curator contacted the Crystal City Historical Society, cross-referenced records, found personnel files, Sergeant Wyatt Morrison, military police, Crystal City Internment Camp, September 1944 to August 1945, returned to Texas after the war, ran the family ranch, never married, died May 1998, age 82, buried in the Crystal City Cemetery. In his effects, letters to his brother Thomas, letters that mentioned a Japanese nurse, a woman who cried while eating bacon, a woman who taught him that enemies were just people scared and lied to. The museum requested copies, added them to the collection. 2 witnesses, 2 sides of the same truth. American guard and Japanese prisoner, both changed by 6 strips of bacon and the weight of mercy. The diary lies open in a museum display case, climate-controlled, preserved forever. Visitors pass by, read the translation card, move on to the next exhibit. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes a visitor stops, reads carefully, stays, reads about the bacon, the cottage, the refrigerator, the truth that poisoned and saved. Reads about a war that ended not with bombs but with breakfast, with kindness that was crueler than cruelty. Reads about the weight of mercy, the burden of survival, the duty of witness. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes that visitor understands that the cruelest weapon is not the bomb, it's the bacon, the cottage, the refrigerator, the truth, and the kindness that makes you survive to watch your whole world burn. In memory of Reiko Nakamura, 1921 to 2000, and Wyatt Morrison, 1916 to 1998, 2 people who met as enemies and died as witnesses to a truth that changed them both forever. May we remember, even in war, mercy matters. Even enemies are human. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone survive to tell the story.